Let's crack into things. Kia ora koutou, my name is Sylvie. I'm MyHR's Chief Evangelist. It is my very great pleasure to be with you on this in Tamaki Makaurau sunny afternoon at least, talking about pay and pay conversations. I would just love to get a quick signal to make sure that you can all hear and see me okay. If you could just type in a comment on the question or raise a hand, that would be super helpful. If you were part of our onboarding webinar last month, you will know that we had some technical difficulties, which meant that the audio cut out about 2/3 of the way through. We don't think that will happen again this time, but if it does happen, I will be doing a much better job of keeping on top of the comments and checking in to make sure that that's working. If there are any issues, I do have a pair of AirPods I can grab to swap things out, so we have a backup plan. Simon, kia ora Simon, because you can hear me well. No one else has had any major problems, so assuming things like well, let's crack into it then. So I'm just going to share my screen and we can get into things. Nice. Now, can I also a couple of comments just to make sure you can see the slideshow that's in front of you? It should say navigating employee pay conversations like a pro with a photo of me there. If you can see it, that's good news, and if you can't see it, obviously that's something that I'm going to need to sort out. But I think back in the Q&A, yep, that looks like it's coming through for everyone. Amazing, thank you team, appreciate your support there. So let's talk about pay conversations and what it is that we're going to be covering off today. But before we get there, as usual, a little bit of housekeeping. But before we begin, the people who get the most out of the session are going to be people who have a responsibility for managing pay. So that might be managers, it might be HR professionals, it might be business owners, anyone who needs to at some point have conversations with their staff or with their team about pay and remuneration. This is not a webinar for employees who are looking to negotiate pay. If you are an employee and not a manager, you are super totally welcome to stick around. It just might not be the best use of your time. So if you are someone who has to have pay conversations on behalf of the business or behalf of the organisation, that's who's going to get the most value out of our time today. Questions are super welcome. I always say that this kind of work comes to life when there's lots of conversation in the room. I can talk for as long as you want me to, but that's not always very interesting or engaging for everyone. So do make sure you pop your questions in. We did have a flood of questions coming through before the session, which is fabulous. So I'll pull those up and make sure I'm speaking to those towards the end of today's conversation. But if there's something you'd like to ask, you're welcome to pop it in the Q&A as we go along. I'll answer them towards the end of the session because I might cover off what you want to know as we go through. Or if you want to wait till the very end before you pop your question in, that's fine as well. The other thing to bear in mind is that the webinar recording and slides will be available after the session. So if you want to ask a question anonymously, make sure you hit that anonymous button. In your question, make sure there isn't any identifying information about the person or the business you're talking about. If I do see anything come through that has those details, I'll do my best to scrub them because there will be a record of this conversation publicly afterwards. And that's it. So in terms of what to expect today, we'll have a very short legal update about some of the law changes that relate to pay and that relate to remuneration. We'll talk about the importance of getting remuneration right and why we spend time thinking about this. We'll talk about the legalities. We'll move on to the different ways you can manage your pay process. We'll talk about the different strategies you can have when it comes to pay. A very quick look at pay parity, and then we'll talk about managing some of those pay conversations. So a pretty broad approach today, but I think that there's a lot that we can cover from the world of pay, and because it's so sensitive sometimes, the ways that these different things interlock can be quite important to cover off. And then, as I promised before, we'll have some time for questions towards the end. Cool. Right, let's kick on. If you hear me clicking around, I'm just making sure I'm keeping an eye on that Q&A. So apologies if it's not as smooth an experience as we normally have. So let's talk about MyHR quickly before we jump into the pay conversation. I want you to know who we are and why we think we have a right to be talking about pay. So we're an outsourced HR provider that was established in 2013, and we're here to make HR easy. Sean and Jason, who are our co-founders, are really good friends who were surfing. Jason was working for Woolworths as National HR Director at the time, and Sean was a small business owner who was having a really hard time finding good HR advice that wasn't hiring an in-house HR person for, you know, $80,000 or $90,000 a year, but also wasn't a lawyer who was going to charge him $400 an hour when he was just a business of 8 or 9 employees and just had some questions about managing a restructure. So the idea for MyHR was born. And what we do is we're outsourced HR covering all employment matters. So that's everything from the start of the employee life cycle. We write job ads for our clients, we write interview questions, we can help them with market remuneration, kind of, you know, looking at what's being paid in the market so they can figure out what to pay their staff, through to onboarding, performance reviews, documentation, policies, all that kind of stuff. That's the proactive side of things. At the other end is what I talk about as the pointy end of HR. So disciplinaries, restructuring, termination for medical incapacity, trial period terminations, all of that kind of stuff. We provide the support for all of our clients to cover all of their needs in that area. What's different about the way that we do what we do, and the reason we can deliver the support we do at the price point that we do, is that we are expert human advisors who are backed by advanced AI, right? So it's all in one powerful, easy to use platform. We have a bunch of systems in place that mean that we can very, very quickly provide meaningful, tailored advice to your particular circumstance. We don't use AI to give advice. That would be mental. You know, robots are still a very long way away from replacing people. But in terms of having a system in place, that means that we can show up, be effective, and not have to charge you a kind of a consulting hourly rate. The system is the way that we do that. We work with businesses in New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. So our New Zealand advisory team supports our New Zealand clients. Our Australian clients are supported by local people in Australia, and the same for Canada. I don't know anything about the award system for the Northern Territories. I would make a terrible Australian HR advisor. So we make sure that whenever you call, if you're in New Zealand, you're not going to get a sleepy Canadian on the phone answering your questions about the Holidays Act, for example. In terms of who we work with, our clients range from very small, from 1 employee, through to 750 employees. Resine Paints is our largest client at the moment, and then everything in between. So we've got manufacturing, we've got FMCG, we've got professional services, lots of clients in the construction and trades industry. There's not a lot we haven't seen, which can be unusual because if you're an HR person used to dealing with a corporate, you're going to find that practices and the reality of what it's like on the ground running a small business very different, to the bank that you're working for example, because our team has exposure to such a wide range of businesses and such a wide range of needs. We can be more creative and more flexible than your traditional HR resources sometimes can be. The other point to note is because we are a SaaS business model, we charge a subscription fee based on your headcount every month. If you're 10 employees or under, it's $295 a month. If you're up to 20, it's $395 a month. And beyond that, it goes up at about $20 per person. So for a business of 100 people, we are going to be about 70% cheaper than your standard HR resource for a business of that size. And for an organisation of 10 or 15 people, we're about 80 to 85% cheaper than your standard consulting needs over the course of a year. We don't have any lock-in contracts. If you don't like us, you're welcome to go. But what we really want to make sure is that we're the fence at the top of the cliff. You might call us 20 times in March because Sylvie's punched a colleague for being rude. You're running a restructure because you've had some dip in your sales. There's no increase to your cost. It will still be that $295 a month for a smaller business. And then in April, you might call us once or twice with a question about Easter. Again, your fees don't change. It just remains the same over the course of the whole year. Again, we want you to get in touch with us. We don't want you to be afraid of receiving these services. Having done that, let's get into the content for today's session. So just in terms of a quick legal update on a couple of things. The first is that a law passed on the 13th of March, so 13 days ago, called the Crimes Theft by Employer Amendment Act. And this means that employers can now face criminal prosecution for not paying employees what they're entitled to, whether that's their wages, not paying their holiday pay, not paying them Kiwi favour. If the employee is entitled to it and the employer doesn't pay them, there's going to be potentially some criminal charges raised. What used to happen is if an employee hadn't been paid fairly or correctly, they would apply to the Employment Relations Authority for an injunction, which would require the employer to pay them. So there were civil penalties and there was a civil route for the employee to raise their concerns, but at no point would there be criminal charges raised against the employer. And this bill changes that. In terms of penalties, if the employer is an individual, they could face up to 1 year in prison and or a fine not exceeding $5,000. If the employer is an entity like a government agency or a charity or a limited liability company, the consequences are a fine not exceeding $30,000. This law is not retroactive, right? So it came into force on the 13th of March. Any pay that was, or any pay that was deliberately withheld from employees from the 13th of March onward may give rise to these criminal charges. Anything that happened before the 13th of March won't count. So if this is immediately raising flags for you, we do have some resources on it. We would recommend, oh, excuse me. We would recommend going through your pay processes, checking what's going on, and if you've got any concerns, seeking some legal advice. This is obviously not a new obligation, right? Employers have always had to pay their employees what they're entitled to. What's new is the introduction of these criminal charges. So the other piece here to note is that there is a piece of legislation currently working its way through the process, right? So it's not law yet, but it is coming. And the Employee Remuneration Disclosure Amendment Bill basically means that employees can safely discuss their pay at work. So this might be talking to a colleague about their pay. It might be asking questions of their employer about what other people are paid. It could be disclosing their pay to any person. You cannot stop, the bill would mean you can't stop employees talking about their pay. Even if you wrote into their employment agreement a clause that said pay is confidential, you may not discuss it, those clauses would not be enforceable, and that's retroactive as well. So if an employee signed an employment agreement in 2023 saying that they would not discuss pay and pay was confidential, then once this law comes into play, that clause no longer applies. Employees can talk about their pay in relation to work with no consequences. Specifically, the bill says that employers cannot take adverse conduct towards or against an employee in retaliation for talking about their pay, basically. So adverse conduct looks like firing them. It looks like treating them differently. It looks like not giving them opportunities that they might otherwise have had access to. It could look like forcing them to retire, like basically anything that you do that is unfair or you wouldn't otherwise have done if you weren't aware that this employee had talked about their pay. This law says that employers cannot do that. Critically, the bill also sets in place a PG for employees to raise specifically if they've experienced adverse conduct as a result of a remuneration disclosure. So if you bully someone because they talked about their pay, if you fire them, if you don't give them the promotion you were going to give them because they've talked about their salary at work, your employees will have grounds for a specific new personal grievance against you for that behaviour. This is currently working its way through the select committee process. It's not currently law, so if you do have confidentiality clauses in your agreements at the moment, those are still enforceable, but be aware that all parties support it except for New Zealand First and ACT, so it has enough votes to pass once it works its way through the select committee process and makes its way to the House for a vote. Cool. Right, let's talk about getting remuneration right. I just had a question come through. I just want to check that that's all still working. Good. Let's talk about getting remuneration right and why we care about it. Obviously, people care about being paid. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone on the call. What is sometimes surprising is that pay is actually a hygiene factor. If you pay people well, like above market rates, they're not any more satisfied with their jobs than people who are just paid fairly. But if people are paid under market rates or below what they think is fair, that upsets people a lot, right? So it's a subtle difference. Good pay doesn't make people any more likely to be satisfied at work. You don't get extra points for paying your people 10 grand a year above what your competitors are paying them. If you're paying them market rates, they're as satisfied with their job. But if you're paying them under market rates or below what they think is fair, people will get very upset very quickly. So it's a hygiene factor. We have to get it right to have happy employees or reasonably happy employees, but it's not a satisfaction factor. People aren't amazingly stoked if they suddenly earn 300 or 400 grand a year. which is good news because it means that we might not choose that pay strategy, which we'll talk about shortly. Getting paid wrong obviously affects retention. If you pay badly compared to other employees, we know that people will look around. It's quite a tight job market at the moment. Unemployment sitting at around 5.1%, which is quite high. It's the highest since the pandemic. So there aren't as many opportunities for employees to jump ship as there has been. But certainly if you have staff who have any kind of skill set, if you're not paying them what they think they're worth and they think they can get more money elsewhere, eventually they will start looking. It obviously affects recruitment. It can be very hard to replace if you're offering below market rates. Most people expect to be able to know what a job is offering in terms of pay when they're looking at different job ads. So if you aren't able to offer market rates, there better be something else that's amazing that you can offer, which would attract people to the role. Otherwise, it might be a bit difficult to recruit for people. Again, the labour market at the moment favours employers, not employees. So that might be a temporary change, but typically speaking, if you're offering below market rates, you're going to find it harder to recruit. It's also a reputational issue. New Zealand is a very small place. The 2 degrees of separation is a real thing. If people become aware that it can be very hard to earn a decent living with you, again, that'll affect your long-term prospects and long-term your ability to recruit people into the business with the skills you need. So a quick look at the legalities then before we talk sort of strategy and different approaches. The first thing to be aware of is that in New Zealand, there are some legal minimums that govern how we can pay people. So there is the adult minimum wage, which increases to $23.50 on the 1st of April. There's also the training and starting out wages, which are 80% of the adult minimum wage. Most people talk about the minimum wage. If there is a collective agreement in place, you must honour what the collective agreement says. And then on top of that, we have KiwiSaver. So the employer's KiwiSaver contribution of 3% must be in addition to base pay. So what I mean by that is you can say, just for easy math, if someone's getting paid $100,000 a year, you can say that the KiwiSaver contribution is on top of that. And so it shows up as different lines in payroll and in your pay slip. You can still say that your total remuneration includes KiwiSaver contributions from the employer, but their pay would now need to be $103,000 a year to account for what their pay would have been, and also then the employer 3%. So you can describe that as being part of a total remuneration package, or you can describe it as being separate, but under no circumstances can an employer avoid paying the 3% contribution for their employees, if their employees are enrolled in KiwiSaver, of course. Particularly for the minimum wage, that means that you will need to pay them $23.50 plus 3%. I'm going to do terrible math on this. An extra $1.10 an hour, $1.20 an hour. Please don't take my word for that. And you can describe that as being $23.50 an hour plus 3%, or include it all in one rate, but it does need to be above the $23.50 minimum wage that comes into effect on the 1st of April. In terms of how we pay people, the law, because it was written in the 1700s, actually assumes that cash is the default and says that if you want to pay your employees not in cash, like with a cheque or with bank transfers, you must specify that that is what's happening in the employment agreement. Most people don't get paid in cash. Most people get paid with a bank transfer. Some people still get paid with cheques. If you're doing that, remember to specifically call it out in your employment agreement. Otherwise, technically, you're in breach of the law there. We also can't control what employees spend their money on. So if you are, and this happens in retail sometimes, if you have a requirement that employees must purchase stock from your business or must wear the company's stock to present an image for the business, you must make that available to them. You cannot require that they spend their own money on the clothes that you want them to wear, or the shoes you want them to wear, or the fishing tackle that you want them to use. So we can't control what employees spend their money on. We can offer discounts to incentivize spending, but if we require them to use company stock or company product in some way, we have to be the ones to fund and to pay that and make that accessible. If you've got additional payments, commissions, bonuses, anything like that, make sure it's laid out clearly how those will be managed and how those will be paid. We have laws that protect against discrimination in New Zealand. So that includes sex, religion, ethnic background, union status, all that kind of stuff. We can't choose to pay people differently based on their demographic factors. We can pay people differently for other reasons, which we'll get into, but we can't be discriminating against people based on who they are as it relates to work. If we get it wrong, of course, there are legal action penalties. You might have to back pay people. The law requires that we keep hold of employment documents for 6 years. So if there is a pay issue, you may be required to back pay it for 6 years of that person's employment, which is quite expensive, especially when we're talking about annual leave that accrues over time. And there can also be penalties if you have discriminated against someone. They can pursue the employment pathway or the human rights pathway and raise a complaint with the Human Rights Commission or the Human Rights Tribunal. If that goes through, those penalties are orders of magnitude higher than the employment pathways. So it can get very expensive very quickly when it comes to discrimination. Cool. But let's talk about how we can manage pay and talk about some different strategies. When it comes to managing your pay processes, especially for small businesses, most have an ad hoc way of managing pay. And by that I mean you might be having conversations with people as it comes up. Maybe you'll check in with someone after they've been there a year and just whack an extra 5K on their salary. There tends to be less structure and more responsiveness in the way that you're managing pay. So the strategy of managing pay in a more ad hoc way totally has some pros, right? So it gives you maximum flexibility to respond to individual circumstances. If you hired someone who you were starting on, $25 an hour, it turns out they're fucking wicked and are amazing. You can very, very quickly just increase their pay to $30 an hour because they're doing such good work in your cafe and delivering such value in the kitchen. There's obviously less bureaucracy and admin hassle. You can kind of just choose to increase someone's pay, and as long as that gets signed off by yourself or by your owner, then good to go. It can feel much more personal and tailored because you're doing it on a person-by-person basis, sort of as and when required. So it can feel quite immediate and quite connected to their circumstances. Allows for those quick responses I mentioned earlier. Means you're avoiding kind of pay bands and rigid one-size-fits-all compensation structures. It gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of not having to adhere to a process that maybe doesn't fit your needs. And it doesn't take ages to set up. Setting up remuneration processes or compensation structures or pay bands takes a lot of time and can take a lot of investment. And if you're a small business, you are going to be flat out just keeping the wheels running anyway. If you don't have the time to get into this kind of stuff, that ad hoc process may be easier to manage. Hopefully not surprising you, this big white blank space on the right-hand side is for the cons of this particular process. So if you are allowing your managers to have some freedom to set pay rates, it relies on your managers being skilled. Or if you're the business owner and just kind of casually managing pay rates, it requires you to be skilled at that. And by skilled, I mean to have a good sense of the quality of work your team are outputting, to have a good sense of who's earning what and is that fair within the team, to have a good sense of, shit, I haven't talked with Sylvia about pay for a year and a half. I probably need to have that conversation with her because we haven't got there for a while. So if you or your team aren't skilled at doing that, you run the risk of some problems. There is more potential for unconscious bias in decision making. Having biases is a feature of being human. It's not a bug. None of us wake up in the morning going, how can I discriminate against people from a different background to me? Or how can I make sure that the men in my business get paid less than the women? Or how can I make sure that people who are younger than me, don't get the same rewards that I get? Obviously, none of us wake up thinking like that, but there are inherent reasons why we are drawn to and feel more connected to people who are more like us, among many, many other biases. And if you don't have a structured process and you're kind of just doing it on the fly, the chance for those biases to creep into the process is a bit higher. It obviously can lead to inequitable pay differences. If you're not reviewing people's work more consistently, perhaps there's someone who you work more closely with, and so you have a better sense of the quality and value of their work, and that means that you are more likely to be giving them these pay rises. If there's someone in the business who also does awesome work, but you're just not as close to, over time, it's likely that those people's pay is not going to increase at the same rate, which isn't fair because the value they're delivering is the same. It obviously makes budgeting and financial planning a bit more challenging. If you are not connecting your pay review process to your budgeting, it's going to be a bit hard to know what's going to come out of the blue in the next quarter or the next couple of quarters. It does make it harder to defend your decisions around pay if someone challenges you, because I just kind of thought it was time to give you some more money is not very data informed, or it's not very defensible. It does lack transparency for your employees who, don't know what to expect, unclear what their process is. It can lead to some favoritism. It can lead to people wanting to work more closely with you. So you see the amazing work they do, so they get a pay rise, which might not be what the business needs. And it's very difficult to benchmark against your market rates if you're kind of just doing it based on a more ad hoc process. I'm just going to check and see if there's been any questions come through about the audio. I think there has been, but I'll just make sure. Cool. Now, the other end of the spectrum here in terms of pay process is to run a more structured pay process. Of course, there are going to be some pros and cons. So a structured pay process, in terms of what it might look like, could be an all business review that happens once a year. Maybe you have some flexibility over the course of the year to respond to personal circumstances. Maybe your call center manager with their team of 10 has a budget of $15,000 to ad hoc increase and reward amazing performance throughout the year. But there's an overall review. Potentially you have pay bands to make it clear that this group of jobs will be paid between $30 an hour and $35 an hour, this group of jobs between $36 and $40 an hour, and this group between $40 and $45. There's obviously many different ways you can run a structured pay process, but basically anything where you're doing it more consistently, where you have some firm guidelines and there's some coordination across the business will fall into this category. So on the pros, it does reduce the potential for bias and favoritism. If there is a regular review where you're comparing everyone in the business against each other, you're going to market and seeing what these jobs are getting paid, you're going to have more factors being considered when giving someone a pay increase than just, oh, I kind of felt like it was time, or I just felt like they were doing awesome work and wanted to give them an increase. So bringing that structure in does reduce the potential for those biases to have a strong effect. Obviously support your budgeting and your financial planning, because you're doing it on a regular cycle. You can be budgeting for the increases. It does help increase employee confidence. So there's some research that shows that employees who understood what happened during the remuneration process were less likely to feel dissatisfied with the outcome, and were a little bit more likely to be satisfied. So it's not major gains, but it is something to consider if you can point to a process and if you can talk about the factors that were considered, the process you went through, and how you arrived at an outcome with a 2% increase or a 10% increase, whatever it is, you're going to be able to defend those decisions more clearly, but also that employee confidence piece will increase for you as well. Obviously allows for more objective performance management. If we feel really good about someone in June, they've been doing an amazing job, we might forget that from January through to March, they were really rubbish. They were totally off the boil. They weren't doing a great job, but we've got a recency bias, which means we think we want to pay them more. Actually, their performance over the first half of the year might not really justify that. And likewise, if someone has an amazing January to October, but they've been off the boil in November and December, you might be feeling a bit more pissed off with them because they're not doing as good a job now. But over the course of the year, they have done some really valuable work. They've been a great member of the team. Their pay rise shouldn't reflect the 2 months of you being grumpy with them. It should reflect their contribution across the entire year. Obviously gives you a chance to benchmark your rates against the market more consistently if you are taking the time to go and look at what's happening in the market and look at your business as a whole. And it just means as a business, you can be more unified and more coherent rather than relying on individual managers or individual people to pick up and have these conversations. Again, of course, there are some cons to this approach. So the first of these is it can require a bunch of time and investment to figure out how you want to do this. Do you want to do a review every year or every 6 months? What happens if someone joins your business a month after the annual review? Does their pay not get reviewed for the next 11 months? Is that going to cause problems? Do you want to have pay bands? Do you want to do some pay transparency with your staff, especially given that people can now talk about their pay sort of openly without fear of retribution? Figuring out how you want to answer all those questions will take some time. And especially for small business owners, again, we just don't have this time in our lives. We're run off our feet just trying to keep things going as it is. So you just may not have the ability or the timing or the ability to sink the time into this right now. It can also feel less flexible and personalized, right? So if people come to you and say, hey, I'd like to have a conversation about my pay, and your response is, we can't do that until March of next year. I know that's 9 months away, but it kind of is what it is. That can feel a bit uncomfortable for employees. It might make them feel a bit less responded to, or reduce your scope as a manager or a business owner to respond to your employees' needs. Again, the bureaucracy can feel quite impersonal. There's a risk of the process becoming too rigid or mechanical. HR people quite like process, so I'm not saying process is bad, but certainly when we rely on process and forget what the purpose of it is, that can mean that it can be difficult to make it feel relevant and current to what's happening in the business. But more admin to manage it all. If you're sitting down as a management team or with your production manager and your sales manager to figure it out, there's a bit more admin involved. It can obviously be challenging to update and maintain. And again, you might not be able to respond quickly to those exceptional circumstances. So your ad hoc option at this end of the scale, highly flexible, but also open to bias and just general inconsistency with all of the negative outcomes of that. Structured approach on this end, many different ways you can be structured. The trade-off is that you're going to get a more consistent, fair process, but individuals might be more likely to feel less responded to, and also there's obviously the admin and sort of overhead and maintenance that managing or maintaining any process may involve. All right, let's talk about pay strategies. So option one for any business is to choose to pay below market rates. Whether you are managing kind of pay reviews ongoing in an ad hoc way or a structured way, if you're choosing to pay below market rates, there are some pros and cons to that approach as well. So obviously, keep your wages bill down. It will have less impact on your cash flow and might increase your margins. So this is often a common approach in businesses where there's high transactions of a low volume. So we're thinking about retail, we're thinking about hospitality, we're thinking about cleaning and kind of admin support services. Paying at or below market rates for these businesses makes sense. There isn't a lot of money in those industries, and so their margins are quite tight. They have to keep quite a close eye on their costs. Also common for not-for-profits and charity and kind of passion industries where people are there because they really care about the work, and the pay can't match it or can't keep up with what's happening in the private sector. Unsurprisingly, there are some trade-offs. You will need to accept high churn in your staff, as well as employee dissatisfaction, or you need to figure out how to compensate them in other ways. So in our retail data, I haven't checked this for a month or two, but the last time I had a look, the turnover rate for our retail businesses was about 98%, which means that every year, if you employ 10 staff, 10 people are leaving and you're having to recruit again. So that might not be all 10 of them. It might be you have 5 roles where people only last an average of 6 months, but you've had 10 people start and leave over that period of time. But that high churn piece, if that's acceptable to you, means that this strategy might be something that you want to consider. In terms of compensating in other ways, we have an amazing culture. Is that why people would stick around, although they could make money elsewhere? You have really, really amazing projects. An example of this would be in the events industry, where people just really want to get involved and be involved in the behind the scenes, even though the pay is not great. Are you a charity or not-for-profit where people expect to be paid less because of their passion for the community or the audience that they support? Is it a glamour industry? Are you a glossy magazine or television where you can have people who are paid less because it's really exciting to work in the industry? Or could you potentially be offering sweat equity for your employees? In startups and small businesses, sometimes people can buy their way in, they can earn their way to shares or an employee share program. So that would be another option to compensate if you don't have the cash flow right now, but long term you expect the value of your business to increase and you can compensate your staff in that way. Option 2 is to pay market rates. Surprising no one, this is often the most common approach in terms of where businesses choose to pay. So the pros to this approach, it does take pay out of the equation when you're compensating for talent. So middle of the road pay rates, you're not paying any more or less than they could get elsewhere. There's always going to be some slight differences, but broadly, a barista working for you is going to earn the same as a barista working 2 streets over, as a barista working a neighbourhood over. There might be small differences, but broadly you're paid the same. This also doesn't unnecessarily inflate your costs, right? So you're keeping costs reasonably manageable. You're not paying too much more than you need to. You can get people for what you're willing to pay. Be aware that this won't entirely remove the risk of employee churn. People choose to leave a job for all sorts of reasons. If it's a toxic workplace, if you're a rubbish manager, if there's something more interesting they can be doing elsewhere. So it doesn't entirely remove the risk of employee churn. You'll certainly have less than if you're paying below market rates, but you are vulnerable to your staff leaving for other reasons. So have a think about why else you might be a great place to work and talk about that. If you're looking to solve a retention problem, think creatively about what your employee value proposition is, and talk about it so people are clear on what they can expect when they work for you. There's also a piece here, and I tried to figure out how to word this, but basically, if you're committed to paying market rates, sometimes you will have opportunities to get people who are really good, but for whatever reason are prepared to accept below market pay. So if someone is changing careers or changing industries, sometimes they're prepared to take a bit of a pay cut to move sideways. But they will be a smart, savvy person who knows how to work and is just kind of learning the ropes of this new industry or this new trade. If you insist on paying the market rate, they'll be pleased, but you might have been able to get them for a bit cheaper given their circumstances in moving industries. So I'm not suggesting lowballing people. I don't think that's a good strategy, but be aware that if you're committed to always paying market rates, there might be times when you can choose not to do that, which are fair based on the circumstances. Of course, the last pay strategy here is you can choose to pay above market rates. This is not an option for most small businesses. It does require having quite deep pockets, but it's one that we should be talking about anyway, just a full picture of the choices available to you. So if you're paying above market rates, people who care about money will come and work for you. And it will be very easy to compete for talent based on the fact that you pay above market rates. I was managing a situation years ago when I was working for a different company and I was in charge of the graduate recruitment program. The candidate that we really wanted had a job offer from a smaller, more nimble engineering company. We were a large corporate with headquarters in Singapore, and so it took us longer to work through the process, which meant that by the time we got to the end of the recruitment process, our preferred candidate had already had an offer from a local outfit who was quicker. But because we were paying, it must have been $12,000 to $13,000 above market rates for new graduates at the time. When I called to make him the offer and I explained what the pay was, he chose to go with us instead of the smaller operator because the pay was so much more significant. So being able to pay people more is an advantage. Most people care about money, especially after the significant inflation and cost of living increases over the last couple of years. This will be a very good tool, if you have it, to recruit people who want to come and work for you. However, it's obviously expensive. Your wage and salary bill is going to be significantly higher than it needs to be. It also may keep your turnover artificially low. If you pay really well, it's going to be hard for people to leave your job and go to a different employer who pays them less. That can be really good if everyone in your business is absolutely amazing and just a star and you don't want any of them to move on. But it can mean that over time you actually don't have people leaving, and so your organization can get quite stale. It also means if there are people who you think are rubbish and would very much like to move them on, you are going to have to be the one to take that proactive action to get them out of there, because the fact that they are paid higher than they could get elsewhere in the market is going to be a massive disincentive for them to leave of their own accord, even if they're also not really happy, even if they also know maybe the job isn't a good fit. It's going to be difficult for them to leave of their own accord. You're probably going to be the one who's going to need to push them. Obviously, there are some opportunity costs. This money might be better spent elsewhere. And the last point here too, again, getting paid more than is reasonable doesn't make people as happy as getting underpaid makes them grumpy. So people who are paid well versus people who are paid market rates don't show any change in job satisfaction or likelihood to stick around compared to other factors like good career progression opportunities, a great place to work, flexible working hours, a manager who supports them, all that kind of stuff. So you're paying a lot of money, you might not be getting the return on it that you expect. A quick word on pay parity before we talk about having pay conversations. Market parity means people are paid fairly compared with jobs at other employers. This will help with that retention risk. It can be hard to assess. Pay data obviously is held privately in New Zealand. We've had quite a few questions come through about how do you find what the market rates for your jobs are, so I'll talk about that shortly. But it can be difficult to figure out sort of what people are getting paid. Internal pay parity means people in different roles, teams, and levels of seniority are being paid fairly when being compared to each other. So questions to ask might include things like, is someone who's earning $120,000 in your business adding twice as much value as someone on $60,000? Sorry, that should say there's a typo there. Or is someone on 100K earning delivering twice as much value as someone on 50K? If the answer is no, there's an internal parity piece there. Do your pay scales make sense? For example, if you have intermediates and juniors, if there's a $30,000 pay difference, and when your junior engineer becomes an intermediate engineer, they go from 65 grand to 95 grand. But if when your intermediate engineers go to senior engineers and they only get a 10K pay increase, does that make sense? Because you've got a huge jump and then a small jump. Do those scales make sense? And then we talk about like-for-like pay parity, which is people in identical or similar roles being paid fairly. Yes, you can pay people differently in the same job when you take into account experience and performance. If you have a receptionist who's been with you for 2 years and a receptionist who's been there for 3 months, paying them differently because the one who's been there longer is better at the job and has more experience, totally fine. That's a perfectly legal, defensible reason to pay people differently. But you can't take into account their gender, religion, whether they're a parent or not, and so on. That's a discriminatory reason. So harking back to how do you manage pay processes, obviously staying on top of all of this, if you have a very ad hoc way of managing pay, means that you run the risk of getting some of these wrong or not having your settings quite right. If you have some structure, it doesn't need to be fully corporate structured, but a bit more in this direction, you can see that it would be easier to manage all of these because you're looking at all of your data internally and externally at the same time, rather than just kind of dealing with individuals and people on a one-to-one basis. So let's talk about how we have these pay conversations. And I really, really want to emphasize that at least half the work happens before you ever get in a room to talk to your team about pay. So it's really critical that you do your homework and do your preparation before you want to try and have a pay conversation. So setting expectations, defining success, and preventing surprises early means for at least 6 months before you come to do a pay review piece, that you are talking about how the business is doing. You are talking about how the economy is going. You're pointing out increase in costs for the business, which are really affecting your margins. You're talking about new contracts that are going to bring in more revenue. You are regularly talking to your employees about their performance at work so that there are no surprises when it comes to a pay conversation. If an employee is surprised by either how much, usually how little, to their perspective, they think they're getting paid, something has gone wrong along that process. There is a lot that a business takes into account when setting pay, including how the business is going, whether it's been a good year or a bad year, what they think is likely to happen going forward, if there have been significant movements in the market in terms of the pay for these roles, if there have been changes internally because you've had to bring on new software development resource, and so there's a bit of internal parity you need to check. All of that stuff is often quite invisible to employees who kind of only see what they're outputting and what they're doing and then connect it to their pay. Because an employee might have had an amazing year and done some great work and smashed their targets and then be expecting a really smashing pay rise. But if the business on the whole is struggling, or if there are some really challenging forecasts or expectations coming through, they're not going to be aware of that. And if they're not aware of it, their expectations will be here and your ability to meet them might be here. So make sure you're doing all you can over the lead up to a pay review, ideally over the whole year beforehand or 6 months beforehand, and make sure you'll be really clear about what's happening so there aren't any of those surprises. Support your decisions with data, right? If the business needs to be sharing some of its financials, do that. If you've gone to look at, for example, the Hayes salary survey, you can show that you've been checking some market pay. If you've got a report from MyHR as a client, which so we market benchmarking for our clients. Be prepared to support that. Show your employee what you've been considering. Review the role, the job description, their growth potential, how they've been behaving themselves at work. If they are delivering amazing results, but they're being a real asshole about how they're getting there, do you really want to be rewarding them with a chunky pay increase when their behavior is not what you want to be seeing at work? Be prepared to explain how the decision was made, look at the market and look at comparable roles, and make sure you've got that market parity piece in place. So quite a bit happens before you get in the room to have the conversation. Again, if the employee is surprised, you have missed a trick along the way to manage their expectations and to give them a heads up about what's coming. We also strongly recommend that you don't have pay conversations at the same time as you're assessing their performance or doing a performance review. Again, the reason being it narrows the employee's focus to what have I delivered over the past year, therefore what should I be getting paid? Whereas performance is a part of the picture when it comes to pay reviews. It doesn't include the economy, how the business is doing, sort of internal parity, market parity. So if you connect the two by going pay and performance reviews are connected, you miss the opportunity to set the employee's expectations based on the whole picture that you're considering. When having the conversation, set the theme, again, explain the factors that were considered and call out their performance contributions. It's a great opportunity to be giving positive feedback about cool stuff your employee has done. So call out what's contributed. Be clear on the details, explain when the new rate will take effect. Are there any tricky pieces of information like the effective date? Are there changes to bonus or commission structure? And answer any questions they have. And that's really it. So you can see the conversation, it can be quite short. This is when it goes well. We'll talk about when it doesn't go well in a second. I tried to think what else I could put here, but really it's just a short conversation to say, as you know, here's what the business has been going through, here's what's gone well this year, here's what hasn't gone well, which means that we are looking at a pay increase for you of sort of 5% or 2.3%. We had a look at the consumer price index, which has gone up by this much. That informed our discussion. So your new pay is going to be $75,000 a year plus 3%. Do math apply again. Is an extra $3,750. That makes a new salary $78,750. So it doesn't need to take long. What takes a long time is the prep and the expectation setting, and then doing your research to kind of explain how you've got to the outcome that you've got to. And then update your system, so your payroll, your HR platform, if there's documentation required, make sure that you're getting in place. What to do when employees are unhappy? People never call HR when things have gone well. They always want to talk about when things haven't gone so well. So let's talk about that. Ultimately, you are not responsible for your employees' feelings. You are responsible for how you respond to your employees' feelings. So even if you think you've given them an amazing pay increase of 6% when everyone else in the business has been getting 3.5% increases, if your employee, for whatever reason, expected a 10% increase, they're going to be disappointed because they don't have your context. That's not your problem. Maybe you missed a trick in terms of setting an expectation for them along the way, but your job now is to respond in a constructive way rather than being responsible for how they feel. So figure out what they wanted. Were they looking for a 10% increase and they only got 5%? That's fine. Set out a plan for them to get to that extra 5%. What would they need to achieve? Could they get there in 6 months? Could they get there in 12 months? What would need to be different about their job or about their performance for them to get to a point where you're comfortable giving them that extra 5%? Is it nothing to do with them and it's all to do with business success? Explain that to them. Say, look, I would give you 10% if I could, but our revenue's down 500 grand on last year and our margins have shrunk from 20% to 12%. There just isn't the money, but here's the plan for the business to get back to a position where we're a bit more financially healthy. And at that point in time, let's have this conversation again. Really encourage people to test their value in market. If your employee says, I reckon I could go out and get myself 20 grand extra a year, you can say, cool, I'd love to see that data, because when I looked at what was in the market, we're comfortable that we're paying fairly based on what's fair in the market right now. I'd love to see your data. Can you come back to me? Can we have a conversation another week or in another 2 weeks? I'd love to see what information you have that I missed, because we think we're paying fairly. Go ahead and do the research and come back to me. Are there things that you can offer them which aren't related to pay? Can you offer them extra flexibility? Can you give them an extra week of unpaid leave a year or an extra week of paid leave? Are there cool projects you can involve them on? Is there development support you can provide them? See if you can close the gap between what they're wanting financially and what you can offer that isn't exactly a dollar for dollar contribution, but still supports their development, their growth, and helps them feel like they've been heard and responded to, given they said they're unhappy with their pay. Don't be afraid to have a frank conversation. And by this, I mean, tell them that they are not performing at the level of the money that they're asking for. So you can, and this is where your prep comes in really handy, right? Because you can have this conversation. So you can say, look, we think it's really important that we're transparent and clear with you. You have not achieved 4 of your 5 objectives for the last year. We've given you a cost of living increase of 2%. You're asking for an increase of 10%. We don't think we can justify that based on your performance. So here's what we need to change. Or if someone says, I can go out and earn more money in the market, say, great, we wish you all the best. We clearly can't meet your expectations, so no hard feelings, it's all good. If you would like some support to find another role, often they will be a difficult person anyway. I'm quite pleased to see the back of them. But don't be afraid to have a frank conversation with them about what happens when there is a gap between their expectations and what it is that you can deliver. Sometimes, if you need to, conduct a stay interview. If you're getting a lot of feedback that you're paying below market rates, or a lot of your employees are unhappy about what they're getting paid, do a couple of conversations with your team to understand why they have stuck around. Is there an amazing culture that you feel uncomfortable talking about because it feels a bit like you're blowing your own trumpet? Are there amazing projects that your staff are getting their hands on that they wouldn't otherwise? If you know from people in your business who have chosen to stay, why they have chosen to stay, the next time it comes to have a potentially uncomfortable pay conversation, you can say to the employee, remember that you get amazing flexibility here. Remember that you have all of these benefits that come from being a small business that you wouldn't have otherwise. Remember that we were super happy for you to go to Hawaii for a month for an international surf comp and work remotely because Hawaii's time zone's a little bit away. You might not get those benefits if you went to a different employer. So what's important to you, Sylvie? What is it that you care about here? And that's it from me. So I'm going to jump out of this and jump into questions, because then I can see what you all lovely people are saying. I'm keen to answer people's questions who are on the call, and then if we run through them, I'll pull the ones that came up before. I'm just going to prioritize people who managed to show up today. Cool. Anonymous says, how do companies manage a fair remuneration strategy when the company isn't doing well financially? Yeah, excellent question. I hope I've covered off some of that during this conversation. The first thing is to be transparent. You don't have to share your whole profit and loss document with everyone every single month. But if you do a quarterly all hands where you explain the financial situation of the company, if you're being really clear and open about the pressures on cost or the downwards pressure on revenue that you're experiencing, if people know the company's not doing so well, when it comes time to say, we can't give you the pay increase you're looking for because we don't have the money to do that, they will still feel disappointed. That's fine, you can't control that, but at least they won't feel surprised or let down or like it's personal, which is what you want to avoid. Those types of feelings are where people tend to get a bit fiery about them. So make sure you're communicating clearly the difficulties that the company's experiencing. Make sure that you are being clear about what those pressures are. And basically, you just want to avoid the surprise towards the end. There might be other things you can do which aren't as expensive. Giving people extra annual leave every year doesn't increase your costs. It does reduce your your productive time that your staff might be doing. But if you can say, look, we can't give you a pay rise right now. We hope that we can in 6 months' time, which is sooner than our normal 12-month review, but we're going to do another review in 6 months because we think the company's going to be in a better position before then. What we can do is we can offer you an extra week of paid time to take off whenever you want between now and that 6-month mark. We know this is disappointing. We want to show you that we value you. It's not about you, it's about the company. Are there other things that you would like that we can support, maybe to do with flexible working hours or what have you? And that's your best bet. You can't magic money up when you don't have it, but the way that you manage expectations and the way that you respond to that situation is what's going to count for your employee. Anonymous asks, what if an employee talks about someone else's pay, like their boss or colleague? I think this question was about that remuneration disclosure piece. So employees can talk about a colleague or boss's pay in the sense that they can say, hey, I would like to know more about how so-and-so is paid. As the employer, you can say, no, I'm not going to share that information. That's confidential between that employee and us. But they can't be punished for asking the question, I guess. Beyond that, if an employee is sharing information that is not related to them, but it's related to a colleague or a boss, that's not appropriate. That's a breach of good faith. If they've come across that information confidentially, they need to keep it confidential. It doesn't mean that employees have a free-for-all to suddenly start sharing information that's private to other people, but it means that they can choose to talk about their pay with someone else, they can ask questions about it, and they can't be punished for talking about their own pay or asking questions. So I hope that helps. Anonymous asks, will the new bill allow employees to talk about the commission scheme they're on? This commission scheme is not in their employment contract. Yeah, anything to do with pay, whether it is or isn't in their employment agreement, commissions, bonuses, value of a car they're getting, anything to do with pay can be discussed. This is the market rates question. So Anonymous asks, market rates are somewhat subjective, and you can always find something to facilitate an answer one way or the other, especially with recruitment reports. What's a good strategy around this? The short answer is there's no silver bullet. Different industries and different sectors have remuneration reports that are pretty robust. The Hayes remuneration survey is one of the most thorough in the country. If you Google Hayes remuneration survey, I don't know if the 2025 one will be out, try 2024. You have to put in your email and your name, you'll get emailed a copy. It's like 180 pages long, it's a massive document, and it goes into different job types where they can, different cities around New Zealand and different pay rates. So the Hayes remuneration report's a good one to start. Otherwise, if you go on Seek and start filtering through jobs, you'll get a range of what those different pay rates are. If you go to advertise or list a job on Seek, it'll tell you sort of where you sit in the market in terms of this is under market rates for this role, this is within the standard range, this is above market, so you get some feedback there. And if you're a MyHR client, get in touch with us. So we've got in New Zealand 35,000 employees and their current pay rates. So for most jobs, we can give you a sense of actually what are people really getting paid, because it's live pay data, right? We're an HRIS. So get in touch with us, we can give you a sense there. Basically, there isn't a way to firmly know it. As long as you're doing some research and getting a sense, that'll serve you in good stead rather than doing no looking at all. Let's have a look. If there is no retribution for talking about pay, does that mean managers can ask what an employee's current salary is if that information is not currently disclosed? Obviously, it would then be at the discretion of the reporter to disclose the manager if it's known. Keen to hear the answer. I might need some more detail there. So you're saying if there's a manager who doesn't have access to this employee's pay, and this manager asks this employee, can the employee choose to disclose it? Yes, they can. The employee can choose to disclose. If this manager doesn't have access to this person's pay because maybe it's your head of sales and this is an HR admin person, I mean, I would feel uncomfortable as an HR admin if the head of sales was asking about my pay. So I don't know that that would be appropriate. But if the employee chose to disclose it, yes, that's fine, I think is your question. Let me know if I've got that one wrong and I'll try again. Cool. Anonymous asks, do you have to give a cost of living pay rise as a minimum, or is it acceptable to not give staff who are not performing any pay rise? Yeah, great question. So there's no legal obligation anywhere at any time to increase an employee's pay. Sometimes employment agreements will say, we commit to reviewing your pay on a regular basis, like you commit to reviewing it, but it won't be a commitment to increase. So you can choose not to give pay rises for all kinds of reasons. What you can't avoid is the consequences of that decision. So if everyone else in the business has received what you've called a cost of living pay increase of 2% or 3%, and you have a few employees who haven't, employees have always talked about their pay. The idea that employees haven't talked about their pay and this is now a new thing that will happen, I think is a vast mystery of the situation. But because there are now no consequences for employees talking about their pay, pretty quickly those employees who didn't get a pay rise are going to find out. And if you haven't had conversations with them to explain why, in their shoes, I'd be pretty pissed off as well. So you can choose not to give people pay rises for any reason. If you're giving a 3% rise across the board because of kind of the cost of living increase, my view is that should apply to everyone, because what you're doing is responding to a cost of increase. You're not responding to performance. But if you choose not to do that, that's perfectly legal. Just be prepared to explain why you've made that choice and to face the consequence. Anonymous asks, lots of anonymous questions today in a pay conversation. Can the business pay less? Can the business pay new hires less to be able to compete in the market when winning new projects? Yeah, you can be paying people in similar roles less than people who've been in that same role for longer. That's a fair reason, because normally people in those roles will have certainly less experience with your business and sometimes less experience overall. What you need to be aware of is that over time, you'll probably need to bring their pay up so that they're being paid fairly. But as long as you're paying someone something appropriate for their experience and for their performance, and that's not based on their gender, their ethnic background, whether they're on a visa or not, that'll be totally fine. And you can make that choice to compete for new projects. You can make that choice just to keep your costs down. It's totally up to you in terms of in terms of how you manage that. Joshua asks, Kia ora, Joshua, then setting expectations around pay increases, do you mean having conversations about what's affecting the business should happen before the meeting conversation with the employee? Yes, 100%. Ideally over the entire year leading up to the pay review. So whether you do a monthly newsletter, if you're a larger organisation, whether you do a quarterly all hands update, whether you, I don't know, have a monthly management meeting that you send out some of the notes from, you should be setting employees' expectations for as far before the pay review conversation as you can about the health of the business, what's affecting your financials, what's affecting your success, because you are keeping employees abreast of the information that will matter when it comes to your pay review time. If you're only having that conversation when you get to the pay review, I think you've missed a trick to manage expectations there. It's legal to do that. I'm not saying you're doing anything wrong, but if you're an employee who has had a really good year in particular, has done a great job, is expecting a big pay increase, trying to then say, well, we can't give you one because of this project we lost 8 months ago, this increase in our raw materials 6 months ago, this change in our export laws, which meant there's now an extra 10% compliance cost 3 months ago. Like, they kind of don't care about that stuff. The time that you had to communicate it to them was at the point in time. Now they just want to talk about their pay. And so it's going to be really hard for you to set a meaningful context for them, because they will be surprised. They haven't kind of been kept in the loop the whole way through. So I strongly recommend, in whatever way is appropriate for your business, keeping people in touch and across what's happening financially sort of as you go along. Yeah. Cool. We are now at 2:04. We've gone 4 minutes over time. If you need to leave, you're very welcome to. The rest of this recording will be available on the webinar. You'll get an email with a follow-up later on. If you'd like to stick around, I do have a few more questions here, so I'm happy to answer those questions. But if you do need to set off, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next time. But we'll keep answering questions for now. Anonymous asks, as a dairy farm, price of milk is great and production has exceeded budget by a lot. Awesome. We love a good news story. I'm so pleased for you. We give a profit share bonus, but employees will expect a huge increase in pay. We need to be mindful that the milk price fluctuates, so we may not be in the same financial position in 6 months. How do we manage those expectations? That's a great question. So I think your profit share bonus is an excellent tool as a one-off. We did an amazing job, but it keeps their remuneration or pay sort of more consistent. Because like you say, when you have peaks and troughs or waves, and times when the business is doing well and times when things are a bit tight, especially with commodities like milk, it can be very difficult to increase people's pay a bunch based on one good season and then have to manage it later on. So I think managing the team's expectations about keeping costs predictable in an unpredictable economy is a sensible place to start. I think having a one-off pay mechanism like a bonus or like a profit share piece is a really good idea, rather than an increase to their base pay. So I think the answer for you is, one, set the expectations. 2, explain why you're making the decisions you're making. And 3, use those one-off mechanisms that are tied to how well you did over a season, as opposed to a massive jump and increase in your base cost. Because exactly like you say, you might not be able to meet those expectations going forward. You want to retain some flexibility for you. But I think you're doing the right things. Just make sure you're being transparent and clearly communicating it. Stephen asked, my employees generally want to talk pay increases during their professional development programs or during their PDPs. You mentioned that's not a good idea. That's valid. How do you shut that conversation down? I think, again, it would be about setting expectations and making it clear what's going to happen and why, so that nothing on the day is a surprise. So if you have previously talked about pay during PDPs fairly, your employees will expect to do the same again this time around. So what you may need to do is to say, hey, everyone, we're changing how we're going to do things this year. We're going to be separating our pay and our PDP conversations. We really want the focus to be on performance and development during these discussions. And we don't want you to worry that your pay is going to be negatively affected if we're giving you some constructive feedback, or if you need to give us some constructive feedback. We want you to feel like this is an honest, open environment talking about development and performance, which is why we're separating pay out. Instead, we will be having pay conversations a month later or as part of the financial year or whenever it is. But explain why you're making a change so people don't get a fright on the day, and explain your reasons for doing that, and I think you'll be fine. Andrew says, hey, FY24-25 is out. Amazing. Thank you, Andrew. So if you Google Hayes Salary Survey 2025 or 2024, you'll get the latest version of that. Anonymous asks, when hiring, how low should you risk going with an offer, assuming that candidates will always negotiate or counter offer? Great question. I don't ever recommend going low with an initial offer. Assuming that candidates will counter offer or negotiate isn't true. We know that women and gender minorities and people from minority backgrounds often don't negotiate their pay, typically white people in New Zealand, and typically men do negotiate their pay. So you run the risk of embedding a gender pay or an ethnic pay inequity piece from the very beginning. What I strongly recommend you do is when you advertise the job, advertise the salary or the salary range on the advert so people can see. When you have a first conversation with them, ask them what their expectations are for the role. And if they say 85K and your range is 80 to 90K, that's all cool. Then when you get to the interview, ask them again, once you've had the interviews, they've got a bit of a sense of what the job involves and what the culture's like. Assume they say 85K again. And then when you get to decide that this is your candidate and you want to make an offer to them, going lower than 85K, I think is quite disrespectful, because they have been consistent and clear with their expectations. It's within the range. There's no reason not to pay them what they've asked for. So one, there's an inequity piece that you risk putting into place if you are trying to lowball candidates, because we know that people don't always negotiate. If you've been asking your candidates what they expect and what their pay would want to be, and then you lowball them, it's a disrespectful kind of choice. So I would never recommend going in with a low offer. I would recommend being as consistent as you can in terms of matching what they're looking for from the role. The law change mean an employee could come to you with data on colleague pay to aid their negotiation? Yes, that's totally right. So if your employee or employees are all saying, what are you getting paid? I'm getting paid $27 an hour. What? I'm getting paid $24.50 an hour. Well, you're getting paid $29 an hour. If they're talking about it, potentially they will come to you when it's time to negotiate their salary and say, we know what we're all getting paid. Here's what we would like to happen as a result of that. I think that I should be getting paid more, or I think I'm getting paid not enough compared to my colleagues. And you're going to have to be able to respond to that. It's a reason we're getting a lot more inquiries from medium-sized businesses about how do they get ahead of these inevitable employee conversations, because they don't want to be in a position where they're getting called out or they're getting put on the spot by employees who have talked about their pay and then brought that information to pay conversations. So the short answer is yes, it means that they can. In terms of how you respond to that, you might want to be getting out ahead of it and making some choices yourself about what you do and don't disclose, or potentially you might need to manage it on a one-to-one basis. But yes, it means your employees could be talking to each other about their pay and then bringing that information to the negotiating table. Lauren, is any tip for managing expectations when someone is being paid well above their role due to longevity in the role and regular annual increases of 20 plus years? Yeah, great question. That's a tricky one. I think, again, it's about setting expectations. So if this person has been getting 3 to 5% increases for 20 years and they're now being paid like 10 grand more than their colleague because they've been there so long, you are totally within your rights to say, we're going to do things differently. We are going to be looking at your contributions and value over the course of the year and making a decision on pay based on that. Because Sylvie, your job hasn't changed for 5 years. Your output and productivity is pretty similar. So we're happy to look at these cost of living increases for you, but we would need to see significant kind of change or improvement in terms of what it is that you do or the work you deliver in order to, continue giving the raises to which you're accustomed. So again, it's that setting expectations piece. Potentially it might be putting a pay freeze on this person for a period of time. And even though you're making a decision that is fair and sensible for the business, be prepared that your employee is probably going to be pretty disappointed, which might mean you get some negative behavior from them around sulking or around rocking the boat and being a bit of a dick at work. They might choose to leave and move on. So you can make whatever choice you want to make, you just can't avoid the consequences. So have a think about what might be likely to happen and what you're prepared to tolerate or manage as a result of that. Anonymous says, we currently don't have any pay review system in place. That's cool. Many businesses don't. When is the best time during the year to do an annual pay review for everyone at one go? Typically, it would align with your financial year. So if your financial year is the 1st of April to the 31st of March, you would be wanting to have do this pay prep in kind of late Jan, early Feb. You would want to be having conversations with your staff about what their new pay increase is going to be in late Feb, early March. Then you would want those pay increases to take effect as part of your new financial year on the 1st of April. There's no law or rule about this. It's totally up to you how you manage it. What is very common is aligning it to the financial year, because normally you're setting your budgets at that time anyway. You could do it 6 months after that if you wanted to just get out of that absolute madness that sometimes is the reporting and financial requirements at financial year end. You then might want to do it 6 months later, and would that be like September, October? Totally up to you. It just depends what cycles and rhythms make sense for your business and your context. What do you advise staff who have roles on an IEA when collective roles get yearly pay grade reviews and pay rises? Yeah, that's a benefit of going with a collective agreement in a union, and a potential downside of being on IEA. So most businesses will review their collectives and their individual employment agreements sort of around the same time. But like you say, it's not guaranteed, right? Because if you haven't negotiated that as an individual, you're not going to get the same benefits and reviews as someone on a collective. So if you are on an IEA, have a conversation with your manager, raise the fact that you would like to have a pay review if you're not getting one, and then sort of take it from there, I guess. But you're right, there's no guarantee, unless it's written into your employment agreement. If you're on an individual agreement, there's no guarantee you're going to get the same treatment as someone on a collective. Anonymous asks, in an interview, are you allowed to ask a candidate what their current pay is? That's a great question. You can totally ask. The candidate doesn't need to tell you, and they also don't need to tell you honestly. I always recommend saying, what remuneration would you be looking for this role? Because what you're getting paid now, that role might be totally unrelated, or for a larger company or a smaller company, or you've been there 10 years and you will have been here no years, so your pay is going to be different. I don't believe that there's always a correlation between what they're currently getting paid and what your job is paying. So I would recommend, rather than saying what are you currently getting paid, saying what would you be looking to get paid for this role. In my experience, about a third of the time, people will tell you what they're getting paid currently anyway. I sort of don't really care. I want to know what they're looking for this job, and if that's within budget and fits what I think that the value is they're going to bring to the role, that's kind of fine. So yes, legal to ask. They don't have to tell you. They sort of have to be honest. A more valuable question, I think, to ask is, what are you looking to get paid for this role? And then take the conversation from there. Anonymous asked, if you are approached by an employee feeling that there is pay bias, how do you address the question? It really depends on what they're bringing to you, I guess. So if someone is raising concerns with you about pay inequity, I would take that pretty seriously. I would ask them where their concerns come from. I would ask them what data they're looking at. I would ask them what's prompted them to bring it to my attention, and then to investigate. And if there is a pay inequity or a pay issue to be resolved, do your best to resolve that issue. If the issue is, I think I should be getting paid more than my colleagues, again, same questions. Why do you think that? What evidence do you have to show me? Do you believe the quality of your work is significantly higher? Do you believe the quantity of your output is higher? Why do you think your pay does not reflect, why do you think there's this issue? And then have the conversation from there. Yeah, that's a really broad question, sorry, so I'm trying to figure out how best to tell you, but do your investigation, ask for more detail, assess what's in front of you, and then make a reasonable decision based on what comes out of that. Anonymous asks, I'm a beginner to employing staff, so please excuse the newbie question. What's the cost to salary ratio we should maintain when recruiting, but also as we review pay year on year? No answer I can give you there. It massively depends on what industry you're in, whether they're a cost center or a profit center. So the way that you would think about ratios for your salespeople versus for your admin staff are going to be quite different. The way that you think about cost to salary in terms of your margins or in terms of your sort of the overhead or your above the line and below the line costs really varies. So do a bit of a Google around what's typical for your industry. There will absolutely be articles and content online that might be helpful, but there isn't a golden ratio I can share with you, unfortunately. It would be great if there was, but yeah, there's too many variables in that for me to provide you with it. I'm sorry. Anonymous asks, last couple of questions here. Anonymous asks, is it not a legal requirement to have an individual employment agreement for every employee? The short answer is yes, unless they're on a collective employment agreement. So if there is a union in place which is representing employees and there's a collective agreement that those employees are on, those employees are covered by a collective agreement. They're not on an individual employment agreement. So you can't have both, because either you're on the collective or you're on the individual. But if you're on an individual employment agreement and you're not a part of a union and there's no collective in place, yes, there should be a written employment agreement in place for every employee in those circumstances. Cool. All right. So one last question. Anonymous asks, how do you waver through reviews that are answered through AI? I'm not quite sure what you're asking there. Do you mean if the employee is giving you feedback that's clearly come from a large language model like ChatGPT or Claude? Yeah, I mean, I think the use of AI is rampant these days, and lots of people use it to. My partner has dyslexia, and so he uses ChatGPT to kind of help him write emails and respond to questions. So if you have someone who's coming to a performance review who has used AI to help explain why they think they've done a good job or why they think the year's gone as it has, I sort of don't need to call that out really. If it's useful information that accurately reflects reality, that's kind of fine. If it's totally disconnected from their goals and their objectives, ask them about it, like sort of interrogate them and ask some questions. But I think the fact that they've used AI doesn't need to be a problem. If they've used AI to get to a position of being more comfortable participating in the performance review, that's great. If they've used it to a point where it's like obscured any connection to the real world, then you might want to have a conversation about that. I hope that answers your question, but if I've got it wrong, to let me know. Cool. We are at the end of all of our questions. So thank you everyone who stuck around for the end of it. Again, there'll be a copy of this recording sent out to you as well as accessible on our YouTube. So if you did miss anything or you want to come back or you've got more questions, you're very welcome to get in touch. My email address is sylvie, SYLVIE @myhr.works. If you're a MyHR client and you would like a market remuneration report for a couple of roles, drop the team an email. They're on help@myhr.works, and yeah, we'll be able to support you from there. So last piece from me, I am going on parental leave at the end of next week, which is very exciting. This, our family's going from 2 to 3, so we're very excited. But it means that you won't be hearing from me with these webinars for the next little while. So be kind to my colleagues who are doing these in my absence. come back through our resources to have a look at what's there and what's available. And I very much look forward to seeing you all when I'm back on deck later in the year. But for now, have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next time.